All right. I do have a passage, one section of this book entitled Why Joe Only Won $10.5 billion, because he didn't take some advice of mine. So, let me give you a little background of the case, and this is a real over-the-top view of the Pennzoil case. If you notice up here that in December of 1984, Hugh Littke, who was the founder and chairman of the board of Pennzoil, made a tender offer for 20% of the stock of Getty Oil. Getty Oil was what John Jeffers described as a magnificent company. It was probably the richest privately held company for a long time till it went public in the world, and it was founded by J. Paul Getty. This tender offer came about because in the fall of '84, there had been real trouble between the business, Getty Oil, and the trust that owned 40% of it, the Family Trust. Family Trust was run by Gordon Getty. He got into a fight with the chairman of the board of Getty Oil because he didn't feel he was doing a good enough job. One of the things he criticized him for was for getting outside the oil business and buying what he considered making a stupid $100 million investment in something called ESPN. So Littke saw a chance to team up with Gordon Getty. Gordon Getty, as the trustee of the trust, controlled 40% of the stock. If he got 20% of the stock, they would control the company. On January 1st, after making his tender offer, Hugh Littke flew to New York and met Gordon Getty at the Pierre Hotel in his suite. And they reached, and this is a term I would ask you to remember as I talk, they reached in a memorandum of agreement. There's a merger agreement in which Pennzoil will buy 3/7 of Getty Oil, and the trust will buy 4/7. And Gordon Getty will become chairman of the board of the new company. Hugh Littke will become the CEO. If it didn't work out under the terms of this agreement after 1 year, they would split their assets 3/7, 4/7, and call it a day if the merger didn't work out. This was in the memorandum of agreement. On January 3rd, up here, God almighty, what? Just stick with me a minute here. All right, on January 3rd, I'm not going to use the laser on here. On January 3rd, the Getty Oil Board of Directors approved the Pennzoil plan 15-1. The next day, and this became crucial to the jury, both the Getty Trust and Pennzoil issued identical press releases of the agreement in principle. And the agreement in principle set out the terms that were found in the memorandum of agreement. 3/7, 4/7, Getty will become the chairman, Hugh Littke will become the president. Now, let me stop there for a moment. Throughout the trial, Joe's opponent was Dick Miller. And I don't know how many of you remember Dick, but Dick was considered by many of his contemporaries to be the equal and opposite, less heralded opposite in terms of his incredible talent. And Dick was a great lawyer. He represented Texaco in this case. So he would refer to this agreement in principle as the case went on as a work in progress. It was never finalized, he would tell the jury. And that was, I'll tell you more about their defense. So on January 4th, you've got the press releases. And on January 5th, there's a little skullduggery that goes on. And the investment banker from Goldman Sachs, wouldn't you know, for Getty Oil, starts peddling the company all around town and across the country and across the world. And Texaco takes the bait. Texaco gets very interested in it. And as John Jeffers pointed out, oil reserves are the lifeblood of oil companies, and they were about out of gas. And Getty Oil had 2.3 billion barrels of reserves. So in this period, and I can't go into all the details, between just the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th, the museum agreed to team up with Texaco. The museum was represented by the famous Marty Lipton. I just want to tell you something. If I ever sell anything like one of my children to a foreign government. I'm hiring Marty Lipton. He cut a deal with Texaco that was astonishing. I won't go into all the details, but he is the seller, and he got Texaco to indemnify the seller. The buyer indemnified the seller against any lawsuits, and by name, the Pennzoil lawsuit. So we move on, and down there on January the 6th, let's see if I can do this right. I'm going to drop one of those compound words that Joe used if this doesn't stop. Anyway, down there on the end, Texaco comes to market with a tender offer for $125 a share. Now, I want to tell you how this happened because it'll become important when I discuss some of Joe's cross-examination. Texaco, over that 2-day period, devised a 3-step plan to take control of Getty Oil and take it away from Pennzoil. They did it with ruthless efficiency. All they had to do, did Texaco, was to convince the museum to team up with Texaco, and they would have 60% of the company. Here's how. The museum had 12% of the shares or so. There were 47 or 48% of the shares in the public. And once Texaco made its tender offer, they would have all the public shares, the museum shares. Now, the sinister part of this is that Gordon Getty was a really decent guy, and he did not want to sell his stock. In fact, the trust agreement would only allow him to sell the Getty stock that he controlled, 40% or so, if there was going to be some sort of financial catastrophe that he faced. Well, if the museum teamed up with Texaco, he would be what's called a locked-out minority. He would have had 40% of a company and not received any dividends. Texaco would have immediately cut off all the dividends. Now, let me tell you something. The trust was made up of family beneficiaries. And if I know one thing about oil heirs, is they don't generally hold jobs, and they don't like to have their dividends cut off. So that's where we are. If I can, I'm sorry to keep doing this. I'm not, as my son will tell you, this is not my greatest talent, electronics. Why should we study the Pennzoil case? Honestly, I think that what I read, what I learned, every young lawyer should know. We should make it part of what everybody studies in law school, especially in trial ad courses. The Pennzoil claim was that Texaco tortiously interfered with its agreement to purchase 3/7 of Getty Oil, costing it $7.53 billion in lost opportunity. I'll talk about that a little more. Plus, he doubled it, did Joe, in punitive damages. Texaco's defense was that Pennzoil had no binding contract. This was decided under New York law. New York law for tortious interference basically is there has to be, as here, a binding contract. 2, Texaco had to know about it. 3, Texaco had to intentionally interfere with that binding contract. Well, that's kind of a silly element because you don't accidentally tortiously interfere with anything. It was intentional. Texaco, if there was a binding contract found, Texaco was in terrible trouble because everybody in the world knew about the agreement between Pennzoil and Getty Oil. It was all over the newspapers. Texaco had spies working inside of on the Pennzoil Getty Oil deal they were telling them everything in this 2-day period. So their real defense, to make it real simple, was they better win on the binding contract. They're better because if the jury found that there was a binding contract, they had tortiously interfered. Where they had an enormous opportunity, Texaco had an enormous opportunity, was on damages. They had 3 excellent expert witnesses ready to testify, and I'll tell you about that in a few minutes. Texaco's defense was there was no binding contract and that the Getty entities had assured him that they were free to deal. They had no contract that keeps them from entering into a contract, Getty Oil, the trust, or the museum. They had no agreements with Pennzoil that would keep them from entering into an agreement with Texaco.